Chapter 37. Another Beginning. Hello, one and all. I have returned. I want to thank you all for your patience, and my gratitude knows no bounds to your continued support. I'm thankful to be here with you all Might said as he addressed the unusually sullen crowd. But after recent events, everyone was worried about what exactly he had to say. It had been a few weeks since Camino, and recently, Mandalore had fallen under some illness that hadn't been specified, but was mentioned due to the squadron protecting Representative Chuchi having all collapsed as one. Fortunately, he and the clones had all fully recovered, along with any of the witnesses who nearly had heart attacks when they suddenly fell into short comas like that. I know that many rumors have been going around as to the purpose of this conference. I am here to place them to rest, he continued, taking a deep breath. I am officially announcing my retirement. Immediately the crowd roared, questions coming from all over the place. Toshinori was nearly blinded by the amount of cameras going off. Please, let there be calm. I will answer your questions after I finish explaining. It took a few more minutes, but eventually the room was quiet enough that he could speak. I must first begin by apologizing, Toshinori said, as he bowed deeply, much to everyone's shock. 6 years ago, I was involved in an extremely brutal fight. In fact, it was the same villain that I fought in Camino that I fought all those years before. Toshinori swallowed as he palmed his side. Although it was healing, it was still something that bore heavily on him. A constant reminder of the mistakes he'd made, and of what not to do. I defeated him, barely, though he managed to escape. However, during the fight, he dealt me a blow that tore out my entire left side. Many gasped in horror, unwilling to imagine such devastation to their idol. Subsequent surgeries and treatments left my body emaciated, even more so than you see today, though fortunately, I've been on the path to recovery. More than that, however, was the damage to my quirk. More gasps, as All Might had been known to keep information about his quirk tightly under wraps. To put it simply, my quirk was an energy source that strengthened my entire body to cataclysmic levels. After my fight, however, my body and quirk began to fail me, and as such, I was forced to reduce my time in active duty. The silence was deafening, although a few began to cry as the impact of his words began to reach the crowd. I'm sure you're wondering why I hid the truth. It's because I had made a promise to my mentor, my mother. Toshinori swallowed thickly as the words left his lips. A few subtle gasps from the crowd. That I would help others and keep their smiles alive through my own. Japan needed its symbol of peace, and I smiled through the pain because every day I continued working was another person I could save. Many began to openly weep, though the majority sniffled or tried to hold back their tears while a few remained stoic, and an even smaller minority scribbled things down on note blocks. For this past year alone, I was only able to work 3 hours a day, which is partially the reason why I accepted the teaching position at UA. This most recent fight was the final nail in the coffin. I can no longer call upon my quirk. I can no longer serve the people of Japan as a hero. The silence was heavy. Toshinori took a breath, as he spoke words he'd been preparing to say for 6 years. I am no longer All Might. After everything that had occurred, it seemed that things were finally calming down for the foreseeable future. Yesterday, All Might had a press conference and had officially declared his retirement, much to the shock of Japan and the world as well. As such a staunch pillar, his legacy had been hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of lives saved throughout his decades of service. All Might had deflected any questions about his and Izuku's relationship, only saying that Mandalore was still recovering and that he had high hopes for the next generation of heroes. A good deflection as any, though the media still hounded for a chance to speak with him with many rumors and speculations as to what the future would entail for Mandalore, since it seemed that All Might, and he would always be All Might to the people of Japan, had his eye on the boy. At this point, maybe he should set up an interview, but with somebody he could trust. He was a bit worried, however. The HPSC was calling for another press conference over what happened during Camino. Questions were being raised about why there were so many civilian deaths, yet not a single one of the VOD had died, as if they hadn't lost enough during the camp. Izuku was exhausted, but after partially recovering, he'd been called to an emergency meeting of the VOD, who'd also called his teachers for an important briefing. All right then, Cody. You called us here. What's going on? Aizawa asked, as he, Nizu, and Yagi, and the other teachers from UA sat down. Across from the table, he noticed the VOD commanders sitting as well. We're here because we need to know more, all of us. We've prepared dossiers on every known villain associated with the League so far, but it still leaves us missing answers. Cody began as he presented a screen and went over the dossiers regarding multiple villains and what the VOD had been able to recover in terms of information. So many villains, so many threats, so many questions, Midnight whispered as she saw just how many villains had been drafted into the League, many of which could be considered heavy hitters. She kept it to herself, but she was glad that the VOD had killed Moonfish and Muscular. Such scum honestly didn't deserve to live in her mind. She mourned, however, knowing that the clones were forced to kill once again. According to the reports, Moonfish had been shot down after being left open by Dark Shadow. The poor thing was still a mess after the summer camp. Nizu would have a field day with her as another sentient quirk. Still, it was good that those villains were off the streets, and either way, Moonfish was on death row and Muscular had an ATK, authorized to kill, order on his head. Still, she couldn't imagine being forced to take a life. She steadfastly ignored the memory of her blasting holes into witching hour, the way his body crumpled and how she'd felt so relieved. Her hand idly twitched towards her leg as the memory stubbornly refused to leave, and she comforted himself by patting the holster on her leg that held Bly's blaster for her. A last resort, of course, but a comforting one. She turned back into the conversation. Cody's briefing about General Grievous was still in full order. All Might, first things first, we need to know, who really is General Grievous, and why is he working with All for One? Cody asked. All Might grimaced. Admittedly, he was ashamed of how this particular villain came to be. It happened during my tour in America. For some context, during the dark ages of quirks, multiple countries splintered, riots, dissidents, opposing factions whether due to religion, philosophy, race, anything and everything started using quirks in open warfare. Masses in the streets, protesting, rioting, opening fire on one another with guns and quirks. Blood ran down the streets and rivers as governments desperately tried to maintain some semblance of control. America went through its second civil war, France's government was toppled, Africa was shattered and ruled by warlords barring a few of the more stable countries. The Middle East practically imploded. Major powers like Russia, China, and the UK splintered. Oddly enough, the only country to remain relatively stable was Australia of all places, though they had their own problems once quirked animals went on the rise. Entire cities going up in flames, wars in neighborhoods, in streets, in buildings. Devastation across entire countries as figures rose and fell from power so rapidly, there was no stability at all. Australians once more uniting as they fought their second Emu War. They lost again. Anyway, going back to Russia. Due to current events, it was strung too thin for the inner turmoil of quirks. An uprising occurred that shattered it before they could isolate themselves to restore order. From ashes and dust, new leaders rose, their followers behind them as they gathered together what they could and rebuilt. One of the newly formed provinces in what was formerly Western Russia, Kali, had been in constant conflict with a neighboring province known as Hook. All right, All Might, prepare for the drop? A soldier called out as they flew over the area. A younger All Might heard the comm and smiled widely in anticipation. This was going to be his first major international mission with US and UN heroes. This new World Heroes Initiative would hopefully gain a lot of traction, and he got to be part of the first mission. We had received a call for help. Hook was willing to agree to multiple conditions in exchange for assistance in an unwarranted attack by Kali. The doors opened and All Might leapt out into the battlefield. Detroit. We were misled.
Smash.
The ground exploded under All Might's force, pushing back hundreds of combatants from both sides before he charged towards the Kali, his raw power devastating them. I ended up facing off against the leader of the Kalish, a warlord known as Kymian Jai Shilal. The warlord fought desperately against the unrelenting force of One for All, but to no avail, until he was finally struck down and defeated. He was arrested, his people sent back to their homeland, Sanctions crippled their economy, and 10 years later, Kaylee would fall, annexed by Hook. A transport going through a frozen desert, its prisoner glaring hatefully at the outside. Shield's transport was bombed, more than likely by the Yamri from Hook. He managed to survive. I suspect all for one, and swore vengeance on me and every other hero who participated in that raid. A resurrected warlord, leading an army, hunting down international heroes one by one. He's a stone-cold killer, and he managed to personally hunt down and kill every single one of those heroes except for myself. I was always the unreachable target. All Might finished explaining, decades of regret making him seem much older. It was only, what, 20 years ago when we found out the truth? Well, there was a lot going on behind the scenes. We found out that the Yamri had raided and enslaved the Kalish. Shalil led his people to freedom but went too far when they started to kill Yamri civilians. War crimes committed by both sides, but by backing the Yamri. Beer, you couldn't have known, Izuku whispered in grief. But that doesn't change the past, does it? He riposted with a wry smirk before shaking his head as he sighed again. It seemed that all of his actions throughout his career were finally catching up to him. Still, have to wonder, now that you've officially announced your retirement, what will Grievous do now? Aizawa asked, and All Might could only shrug. Retired? Retired. Grievous roared in fury before slamming his fist on the table, swiping away at his attendants. But Master, would this not mean that he is weakened? You can rightfully take your revenge after all these decades. You fool, he roared, backhanding away his attendant. I would face my enemy at their full strength, so that there is no doubt of my complete victory. Grievous snarled as he paced the room. But now, with All Might retired, his quirk gone, then that means that any victory against him would be a hollow victory. No one would accept my strength over his, only see me attacking a weak, old man. Grievous slammed his arms against the table again, shattering it into pieces. Then why not go after Mandalore again? You had no problems with that during the camp, another voice said from the side, and Grievous turned to see Shigaraki staring at him in contempt. That was different, if you recall. I was under orders to attack the child. And if I recall correctly, you definitely wanted to make it hurt, wanted to make All Might hurt. An emotionally compromised adversary is another strength to you, Grievous replied. I have used fear, intimidation, rage, grief, hatred, and more to antagonize my opponents, to prey on their weaknesses, to ensure their mistakes and deliver their doom. And now? My vengeance can now no longer be completed. All Might has finally slipped through my fingers. My ancestors look upon me in shame. Grievous bowed his head in disgust. Perhaps so, but it still stands that Mandalore is proving to be a greater threat, Shigaraki stated as he stalked forward. He has an army, and although we now have one of our own, quality makes such a difference, doesn't it? After all, he and his clones pushed you back, didn't they? Grievous snarled, as he recalled being caught off guard by the flying ship. He underestimated Mandalore and that girl who fought by his side. It was peaceful. Finally, after everything that occurred, Izuku felt truly relaxed. His body was still recovering, and he'd undergone multiple batteries of tests from Recovery Girl, but so far, everything seemed to be going well. Barring a few irregularities with some of his cells, he was fit as a fiddle. Did I really just think of fit as a fiddle? Still though, with everything that was going on, he managed to finally take Ochako out on a date like he promised. At first, he was honestly nervous. This was his first date after all, and he wanted to do right by Ochako. But with some advice from his mother, Toshinori, and surprisingly enough Aizawa-sensei of all people, he managed to relax and the two had a great time together. Fortunately for him, since Ochako lived alone, he didn't have to get the shovel talk from her father just yet. Granted, a part of him knew that there wasn't really anything he could do, but still, it was the principle of the matter. Why, if Eri got it into her head to go on a date? No, bad thoughts. Izuku thought as he shook his head of a terrifying future and focused on the now. The two were at a park now after eating lunch, simply enjoying each other's presence. Their hands were softly intertwined, and they leaned into each other. Their date had actually led them a bit around Japan. Unfortunately, Izuku's newfound popularity was very counterproductive to privacy. Fortunately, he was able to buy a hat and sunglasses, which somehow worked. According to Toshinori, they had saved him countless times when he was in civilian mode, back before his injury, as he could claim that he was an All Might fan who worked out. Damn it, after seeing the videos, I can see why it worked. Somehow, however, they ended up back in Camino. They stood far away from the construction site, although, to be fair, it was currently a deconstruction site. A lot of buildings had been toppled or structurally weakened, so they needed to clear the debris. My parents are here too. The damage was so extensive that multiple construction companies were called in, Ochako commented as she peered over the fence, perhaps wondering if she could see her parents in the middle of the bustling construction zone. Izuku nodded, already thinking of things that could be done to help. Perhaps he could summon, once he was fully healed of course, another ATE and have the support course modify it for construction purposes? Whatcha thinking about, Izuku? Ochako asked with a small nudge, her kansai slipping through since she felt more comfortable with him. Just wanting to help, I guess, he muttered as more thoughts and ideas flew through his mind. Of establishing a construction corps and ensuring that if he got into villain fights that whatever damage occurred was taken care of. Of course, Ochako chuckled, bringing him out of his thoughts and making him slightly flush. They remained in a comfortable silence, observing the busy construction site. Thank you, Izuku began, as he recalled the events that had just happened and more. Meeting her outside of UA with Django, facing the zero-pointer, the sports festival, the camp, where she took charge and started the counterattack, Camino, where she led them with Darksaber in hand to rescue him, and most recently, the Mindscape, where she led the charge to save him again. For saving me. Izuku, you don't need to do that, Ochako said as she faced him, gently cupping his cheek. He leaned into her hand, his own hand reaching up and holding it, looking deep into her eyes. She noticed how tired his eyes were, exhausted even, but he looked relieved. You're so important to all of us. Of course we'd come to save you, she softly declared, determination visible in her eyes. It's not just that, Izuku replied as he sighed a bit. You were my first friend in so long. You helped me and stood by my side in the sports festival. You comforted me and gave me strength. It's why I've grown to care for you so deeply. Izuku, are you saying that you love me? Ochako nervously asked, truthfully very nervous. They were still young and oh so inexperienced. She wouldn't know how to respond if he said such a thing at this moment in time. No, not yet, he replied honestly. It's still too soon. But I'd like to find out with you. He somewhat finished shyly, much to her relief as she took a calming breath. Ochako felt her nerves die down now, instead replaced by calm and even excitement. I'd like that, she replied earnestly. Truth be told, I was a bit worried about starting a relationship, 'cause, well, we're heroes in training and one day we'll be heroes. But I've grown to care for you too, and after everything that's happened, I want to take every opportunity life gives me. She's too cute, Izuku thought as he had to close his eyes from her sudden brightness. So, I'd like to continue doing this, see where it takes us. We can take it as slow as you want, Ochako. I'm in no rush. I just like being with you, he said. She flushed heavily and lightly punched his chest as he chuckled before burying her face into his chest. No fair. You can't say things like that out of nowhere. Sorry, ha ha ha. A sudden ping caught his attention, and he quickly grabbed his phone. Oh, Mom wants me to invite you for dinner. Do you want to come? Ochako nodded and, after waiting a bit so that the flush in her cheeks died down, took his hand and led him to the train station. Toshinori was the first to arrive for dinner. Lately, he and Inko had been spending much more time alone together, and he was fully considering moving in. Of course, that meant finally telling Izuku about their relationship. Should they have told him earlier? Yes. They both had a talk about it, and while the whole secret romance thing was very romantic/exciting, it was also selfish of them to keep it from their son. Toshinori admitted that once, he would have loved to have had a kid of his own. But the looming threat of all for one, the reminder of what happened to Nana's family, and how her very grandson had been corrupted, Throughout the decades, he'd had small flings, but nothing ever fully developed. He couldn't even think about adopting either, as any child would have faced unimaginable amounts of scrutiny once it got out. Then there was his fight with All for One, and the damage had killed any chance of having a biological child. And he ceased his thoughts on adopting. After all, it would be cruel to adopt and raise a child on your deathbed. But then he met Izuku and Django. He met Inko and the rest of the VOD, and he truly felt part of a family. It's why, after dinner, he planned on speaking with Izuku personally to let him know his true feelings on the matter. He idly patted the box in his pocket. He'd done so multiple times already, but it was grounding to do so. He opened the door, and the smell of katsudon filled the apartment, making him drool. His stomach rumbled. He still marveled at how much he'd improved. He can have real food now. He hummed in delight as he remembered Inko making his first meal in years after he was declared fit to eat normally. Granted, it was a light meal, but it was a meal nonetheless. Plus, she promised to make him an all-American style breakfast one of these days once he was better suited for heavy foods. Walking into the kitchen with a hum, he tiptoed over to an oblivious Inko who was currently preparing the vegetables for the katsudon along with Cut who was preparing the tonkatsu for the dish, breading the meat and frying it. The clone wearing a pink apron and headband similar to Inko's along with some gloves so the oil wouldn't burn him. With a squeal of surprise, she jumped as he hugged her from behind, laughing softly. Tashinori, I've told you not to do that, she pouted as he let go and laughed loudly.
Sorry.
Sorry, sire. He chuckled as she grabbed a ladle and swung it threateningly. Cut was, more or less, ignoring the two lovebirds. Tashinori had come over so many times at this point that their antics didn't even bother him anymore. To be frank, he had more or less forced himself to be able to calm down like this, considering the first time he'd pulled the stunt of hugging Inko from behind. The now former #1 hero had gotten a stun round to the face. Besides, VOD seemed fine with it. Soon, Cut would realize that VOD was not in fact even aware of it. Emph! She crossed her arms before another thought passed through her mind and she flushed deeply, becoming even more nervous than usual. Tashinori, we're still telling Izuku tonight, right? She shakily asked. Yes. Is something wrong?
No.
Well, there's something I need to tell you, she said as she began to twirl her hair around her fingers, a sight that always put a smile on Tashinori's face. It was super endearing, but something seemed off. What's going on? She took a deep breath, deciding to bite the bullet. Hi, Mom. I'm home with Ochako Dash.
Toshinori, I'm pregnant.
The sound of Cut dropping the chopsticks he was holding, followed by the eggs he was refilling into the bowl for breading, along with the newest piece of pork, could be heard falling to the floor as he looked at the two with mouth agape. Tashinori's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find words. Fortunately, or rather, unfortunately for him, he didn't need to say anything. Tashinori. He slowly turned to see Izuku shrouded in darkness, his eyes being the only thing poking through. Scary. Would you mind explaining to me why my mother feels the need to tell you she's pregnant? Well, we were going to tell you today, Tashinori sheepishly said. Sit down, Tashinori. This is gonna be a luang night. Cut muttered as he prepared the last bowl of katsudon almost robotically. The ensuing dinner was really awkward. Usually it was the father staring down the boyfriend in these kinds of situations. Now it was the reverse. Bear in mind that the only reason I'm not kicking your ass is because you're still recovering. Izuku began before being interrupted. Izuku, stop being mean. It's my fault. Inko interjected. Inko, if anything, it's mine. Tashinori protested. No, I'm the one that invited you in for dinner the first time. I'm the one that kissed you. Well, I'm the one who took things to the next level. KRK. Izuku began to loudly cough as he was now faced with the horror of the entire situation, catching their attention. Okay, we're not discussing this part any further, Izuku said after recovering. I just want to know when this started and why you thought it'd be a good idea to keep this from me. The blushing couple gathered their thoughts and explained. how much closer they'd become after the sports festival, how Tashinori would look forward to meals throughout the day, which evolved to actual dates, movie nights, and more. Inko also talked about looking forward to the moments where he would pass by and they would simply eat and talk. She also shared about how Tashinori helped her through her grief and through the bad days that plagued her, and she in turn helped him process his injury and the resulting feelings of worthlessness due to being unable to help. Eventually, things evolved and we fell in love, Tashinori gently said as he held onto Inko's hand. Intertwined on top of the table, the sheer honesty in his gaze made Izuku's eyes widen, especially since he saw the same in his mother's eyes. We wanted to keep it a secret because we didn't want to add more to your plate, although I've been considering moving in, so we were planning on telling you tonight. We were going to earlier, but with everything that was going on, it kept being pushed back, Tashinori said with a disappointed sigh. He'd hoped to break the news easier to his son. And now you're pregnant, Izuku said, still in slight disbelief as he turned to his mother. It was putting images in his mind that he did not want to think about. Yes, I found out earlier this week, and today I went to the doctor to confirm it. I'm a few weeks already, Inko shyly said. They totally did it after Kamino, was the thought that passed through Ochako's mind before she flushed and hid her face, muffling her giggles. She couldn't help it. This entire situation was actually really funny to her. Izuku gave her an unimpressed glare that only made her want to laugh even more. To be fair, I didn't really think it'd be possible, Izuku. After my first fight with All For One I was left sterile, Tashinori sheepishly added. You've also been inside Bacta for months, Beer. It healed your stomach and your lungs. Why wouldn't it heal that? He pointed it out with a blush. Tashinori blushed too as he realized his folly. Healed it really good too. Imolum/Inko. I didn't mean to say it out loud. Sorry. Inko cried out with an embarrassed shriek. That was it for Ochako, who burst out laughing like a maniac over the absurdity of the entire situation, much to the trio's consternation. May I give a second opinion? Doesn't this household already have more than 1,100 mouths to feed? Cut finally spoke up, having been quiet throughout most of the conversation, as he felt like it didn't involve him. And I have 9,000 more in here. Your point? Izuku deadpanned to his brother, while poking his temple. And to be frank, U.A is feeding them. Touché. Anyhow, how? Just how did you get this past me? I literally live here. Cut exclaimed while pointing an accusing finger at his mother and former symbol of peace. I should have been able to pick up on anything going on in this tiny apartment. At that, Tashinori looked away and somehow managed to whistle despite his lips seemingly being non-existent, while Inko shuffled around slightly with a blush adorning her face as she felt Cut's gaze boring into her. Ihe. Remember all those errands you were sent on? What are you?
No.
Y'all did not. I can't believe ya, Cut said, standing up fast enough to make his chair fall over. Cut, your kansai is slipping through, Izuku said with a calm expression, taking a sip of water while having his eyes closed while Ochako just looked at him bewildered. This being the first time hearing one of Izuku's clone with the same dialect as her. It was honestly rather hot. I can't ignore this or even. Ya darn told me protectin' Beer was my responsibility after the USJ, the clone said, before turning on his heel to go somewhere. You can't shoot him, Cut. Only I get to do that, Izuku sighed, his tone sounding surprisingly cold. Tashinori whimpered. Izuku, that's enough. Inko cut in, surprisingly stern, and he blinked in surprise. Yes, we shouldn't have kept this from you, but that gives you no right to intimidate Tashinori like that. Beer. He's good for me, Izuku. He's good for you, too. He's helped me out so much. I feel like I've finally been healing, not only from Django but also his Hisashi. She bit out. Izuku's eyes widened. His mother hadn't dared to even whisper the man's name in over a decade. Beer, why didn't you tell me about how you were feeling? Izuku asked sorrowfully, unwilling to see his mother in pain. Because you're my boy. I'm supposed to take care of you, not add more to your plate. You've been handling Django's death so well and She shakily gulped, trying to will the tears to not fall. She'd been strong until now, she could remain strong. Beer. There are still nights where I cry myself to sleep. I just didn't want you to know. Izuku tearily admitted as he hugged her tightly. The two shakily chuckled, seeing the irony in each other's statements. Let's make a promise. No more secrets, not between us, all right? He whispered. Yeah, that sounds great, Izuku. In that case, I feel that now more than ever, I should share one last secret. Toshinori declared as he shifted to face Inko. Inko, the day that I met you was because of tragedy, yet through that tragedy, we have grown to become something amazing. I no longer wish to hold back. I no longer wish to hide. With a heave of exertion, he puffed up and kneeled, taking out the box in his pocket. Will you marry me? The table gasped and Inko could only stare. All Might was shaking in place, a combination of nerves and strain. Inko's hands gently touched his face. Change back, she gently whispered. Huh. I fell in love with Yagi Toshinori, not All Might, she clarified, her eyes pleading with him. He blinked before nodding and deflating, gasping in slight exertion. Inko smiled widely at him and nodded. Yes. The next day, the entire class was assembled along with their clone companions, discussing a few things, with some of them seeming slightly clingy, much to the confusion of the clones. Apparently, they didn't remember any of what had happened. A few noticed Kyuka was wearing a purple scarf with yellow accents around her neck, most likely to help it heal better, while Momo was surprisingly texting on her phone. Seems like she was writing to each and every member of the so-called wolf pack, as the other had begun referring to the clones who'd been adopted by the Yaoyorosis. You should have seen Kodai-san this morning. The first thing she did when she saw Phil was pull off his helmet and then kiss him in front of everyone. It was the boldest thing I've seen the whole semester, Shiro said as he recalled what just about everyone had seen only a few minutes prior. You think that's crazy? Didn't you see what Tokage-san did? She more or less just slithered around Waxer and whispered something to him that caused him to get the mother of all nosebleeds, Denki said, referring to Waxer who currently had the front of his armor painted red rather than white and orange. Their discussion was cut short by Aizawa entering the classroom, looking tired as ever with everyone immediately scrambling to their seats and waiting in anticipation for what was going to happen. All right, you problem children. Due to the recent events of the attack on the summer camp, Kamino and Midoriya being attacked mentally, we've went all out and gone to your parents and the HPSC to discuss for an earlier license exam, so you can act more freely, since you can't seem to stay out of trouble. Your parents all agreed to the idea, as they felt it would be safer for you to get licenses to defend yourselves alongside the VODE in case of villain attacks. Aizawa finished, causing the class to murmur amongst themselves. Had it been earlier in the year, they would have been screaming and shouting in excitement. But after everything that had occurred, they could tell that this responsibility would weigh heavily on them once they achieved it. That's not all, however. The recent events have also caused us, the staff, to decide that it's time for you to come up with super moves of your own to strengthen your quirks even further. Remember, you can't always rely on the gear and toys provided to you by the VOD and Midoriya. At the mention of super moves, the entire class, sans Kyuka who was still mute, erupted into excited chatter and gestures. You will join up with Class 1B at Training Ground Gamma, along with the more personable clones. You have 10 minutes to get changed and ready. With that he left, quickly followed by the students and clones, the class meeting their sister class in the hallway as they all rushed towards the changing rooms at Ground Gamma with hero costumes in hand. Have any of you thought about what your super moves will be? I'm gonna try and become the hardest wall to protect my friends. Ijiro said as he and Tetsu fist bumped each other, both of them apparently having the same idea. Are we sure you two aren't brothers separated by birth? Because you act even more like siblings than we do, Boyle said to the manly duo as they ran. They must at least be born under the same star. Dragon cackled as he rubbed his hands together, thinking up ways to use his flamethrower even better. What about you, Orivod? Rex asked Izuku, who just looked at his brother and smiled. You'll have to see, Rex. You'll have to see. At Ground Gamma. As you all can see, Gamma is a free place to work on your super moves, thanks to the efforts of Cementos. Aizawa began as he addressed both classes. As you all have probably seen, Super moves are entirely different class of movesets that differentiate you from other heroes, and their own super moves. Aizawa began as Samintas began to set up the arena. Most are combative in nature, whether they be a final blow, a restrictive move, or even a defensive maneuver. Ectoplasm continued as he began to form clones of his own. A few aren't combative at all, perhaps being used for the defense of civilians, removal of debris, or even simply to catch attention. Aizawa said, glancing slightly at Aoyama when mentioning the attention part, considering how much of it he could be the target of in the field with the sparkles. Among your classes, you even have a few that can be considered super moves already, such as Ida's Recipro Burst, Bakugo's Howitzer Impact, and Midoriya's Legion. Forward March. Samintas commented. Others have the potential to already be super moves with just a bit more refinement, like with yourselves, Kaminari, Jairu, and Todoroki, Midnight said as she referenced their various abilities. Shortly after getting changed into their costumes, both hero students and clones were in full swing of developing super moves and better tactics to use in the field. Some were sparring with each other to help with that. For example, Momo, who had gotten a few blueprints from the clone engineers, was currently training with creating a mass driver from herself like her cannons, with limited success. Yui was jumping around, training her acrobatics while also improving her throwing arm and quirk by releasing several shrunk thermal detonators out of her pocket and throwing them before returning them to their normal size, all while jumping all over the place. Tenya was speeding around using his shoulder-mounted blaster and repulsors, while also training his Recipro boost to last longer and cool down faster. The clones too were busy at work. Super move. Bunker breaching. The clone CT, 7894, better known by the name Breach, shouted, as he loaded a slug into his shotgun and fired it on a nearby cliff, creating a man-sized hole at least 4 meters deep, causing most of the cliff around it to crack. Holy Buddha on a peach tree. What the hell are those things? Zero exclaimed as he saw the sheer destruction the round had caused. This, my friend, is a doomsday round, an original invention of mine, packing 100 times the punch of a normal shotgun round. What do you think? The clone asked excitedly as he nearly got into the tape swinger's face. Never, ever use those things on a living being. Also, what the hell do those things even cost? Oh, 5,000 yen per piece, nothing too bad, he grinned. Oh, maybe Momo could mass-produce them for me. He cackled, before getting chopped on the head by Zero. In your dreams. You bomb maniac. Did someone call for a demolitionist? A voice that sounded just like Izuku's called out, although this one sounded a lot more macho to say the least. I know all of you are different individuals, but I just can't get used to hearing Midoriya's voice sounding macho. No offense, Zero deadpanned as the tall clone, CT-3244, going by the name Dust, walked over with his rifle slung over his shoulder and holding a grenade for its underslung launcher in his other hand. None taken, my friend. Now, Breach, you call that pea shooter a weapon? This is a weapon, he said and took off the rifle from his shoulder, showing it off. And it's bigger than yours. He smirked. Bite me, Dust. You think that can compare to my doomsday rounds? In your dreams. I wouldn't sleep on my darling here. Observe, he said as he loaded the launcher and fired it over the cliff. You missed. Breach cackled over the seemingly clumsy shot. Wait for it, Dust said as he turned around, just as the grenade separated into several smaller projectiles and landed, causing a row of explosions to appear behind the clone, making him look like a typical hero from a pre-quirk action movie. Super move, Jericho Barrage, he said proudly. Zero could only look at the destruction, wondering where the hell these two even got these crazy contraptions from. Fucking show-off. Breach grumbled as he had somehow made his way over in a corner and was drawing something while swearing at his brother. I should really get go dash. Zero tried to leave, only to feel a chill down his spine as he looked around to see a figure looming over him, his visor glowing a ghastly green while wielding what looked like a warglaive in each hand along with the strange device on his back that had something that looked like wings attached to him. Mommy, was all Zero could muster out. You are not prepared to leave yet, young Hanta. You must observe others to learn and take inspiration for your own super moves, the clone said, his voice filter making his voice reverberate slightly.
Yo, Torque.
Stop trying to act like Tokoyami. You're scaring the kid, Dust said before walking over and placing his hand on his brother's shoulder. I am merely stating the facts. He didn't participate in Camino and must therefore observe us to get more inspiration for himself. Also, don't you diss Tokoyami. He is cool, Torque, also known by his number CT 2225 replied, before flying up with his winged jetpack and activated his glaives, the blades beginning to glow green. Feel the hatred of 10,000 years, he bellowed, before he dove down and cut a smaller cleft in twain, landing with his arms crossed as the massive rock fell to each side, perfectly split in the middle. Super move, Azanoth. Zero just looked at the rock and back to the clone, then back to the rock again, feeling like he was getting caught up in something he really shouldn't be. Just as he attempted to walk away again, he felt something graze his hair, followed by a slightly burnt smell as he felt the top of his head where a strand of hair had been burnt, before he felt something and looked down at his hand with a dead mosquito in it. Hey, not cool, Fenrir. Wait, the hell are you doing here? You're supposed to be at the mansion with the wolf pack. Zero shouted as he looked up at the sniper clone sitting in an elevated position, his visor down and a box of dog biscuits next to him. Half the wolf pack is here to practice our moves, he said, before lifting up his visor. Super move, Hunter Eye, he growled, before removing the mouthpiece of his helmet and popped in a biscuit. Zero once again tried to escape, only for a bell to ring, with a chair being pushed under him, making him sit down as yet another clone came walking, this one cackling like a maniac. Can't have the guest of honor leave so soon, can we? The clone, who seemed to be split into two, said, right side white while the other side was black, and his visor also being split in two colors, black and red, with the red part also having a scope. The most notable thing, however, were the bare ears on his helmet. Oh no, not you. Anyone but you? Zero whimpered out as the clone approached. Ah, don't be scared of little ol me. After all, don't you want to win the jackpot? The clone, CT 0428, also known as Jackpot, snickered, his laugh sounding slightly sinister. Look, I don't have time for games right now, so dash, Zero said as he tried to stand up, only to find the clone in front of him again. Now, why don't we roll the dice? Jackpot laughed as he rolled said object, landing on a 6. Oh, Jackpot, I guess this means I'll go with this one, he said as he took out a small toy hammer, smacking a button on his wrist. Just as he did that, small robotic arms came out of his backpack and took out parts, before they assembled something which ended up being something that looked like a rocket launcher. Super move, 6 bells, he said, just as he pressed the trigger and fired a continuous beam that cut through the cliff in front of him. Seeing the poor cliff being decimated once again, Zero tried to shuffle away, this time determined to get away from this bunch of crazy personalities, only to bump into yet another one. Careful there, Hanta. This equipment is expensive and sensitive, CT 3426, known by the name Morse, chuckled as he came walking over with some strange backpack with several small paraballs on it along with antennae. Morse, how many conversations are you currently having? Zero asked the communicator clone. Oh, just the basics. Only about 50 or so at once, he replied with a smile on his face like it was the most normal thing in the world, before quickly giving a quick response to a request he received. Screw this, I'm out of here. Zero yelped as he fired his tape at one of the cliffs and swung away, with the 6 clones looking at each other before nodding and giving chase. While what would soon turn into a wild goose chase began, other students and clones were busy practicing their own super moves or just upgrading their gear and weapons. Izuku was practicing with the Darksaber alongside Denki, Yanagi, and Tokoyami, who each were using Shurnai they had borrowed from the Kendo Club. Alright, repeat my movements. After this, we'll switch out so Yanagi-san can show the technique she knows. He called out to the trio, who each nodded in return as they kept on with their swordsmanship training. The 2 boys due to wanting to wield swords, and the girl because she needed to remove the rust. Izuku had noticed back in the forest how the technique that ran in her family seemed more stiff in its movements, along with looking more like a standard kata, rather than something meant for actual combat. A few minutes after practicing Makashi later, they switched out so Izuku stood with Tokoyami and Denki while Yanagi stood in front of them. Midoriya-san has already seen some of this, but this is the swordsman's technique that has been passed down my family for generations. Its name is Shicho, she announced, before showing off some of the techniques used in it. What they saw seemed a bit like traditional sword fighting. However, there was a lot more aggressiveness behind the movements, along with each swing and parry seeming unpredictable and the attacks even lethal at times, despite primarily cutting where an opponent's limbs would be. While it did look a bit crude and brutal in its swings, Izuku did like the unpredictability it came with, as being unpredictable was a huge part of fighting in close-quarters combat. Tokoyami, on the other hand, liked the ferociousness, while Denki, well, he was still more or less just testing the waters. While the blade felt really cool, it didn't really fit him. He honestly didn't know what to feel. Maybe it was just the style in particular? After some time training with the sword, however, he decided to change pace and focus on the entire point of this lesson. Super moves. He'd been slowly getting more and more comfortable with his lightning, but he was still hesitant in using it around so many people. Back inside the mindscape, everything had been so chaotic that he hadn't had a chance to think before he was already unleashing his power. What he didn't tell anyone, though, is how he had taken so long to reunite with the others because of how desperately shaken he was. The power that he'd unleashed had practically turned a droid into dust. What could it have done to a human had he not maintained control? No, can't think like that. Focus, breathe, stay calm. Think about what makes you happy, what you want to protect. Denki sighed deeply as he closed his eyes and focused. At first, his mind was assaulted with terrible images, agony searing through every vein as his circuits were reversed, his very body violated. A blind rage and hatred, so encompassing, so devouring that it could rival a black hole. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. That power may have been unlocked by the rotten apple of the family, but you decide how you will use it. As long as you maintain your sense of yourself, then that power will save countless lives one day. His uncle's words resonated within his head as he looked at the blade in his hands. And he focused. Noshiko, her innocent smile that he so desperately wanted to protect. Even though he feared her reaction once she discovered the truth, he still wanted to protect her. His mother, still in a coma, but slowly improving. And Kyoka, he really wanted to hear her sing one day. In, out, flow like water, roar like fire. Lightning flows from within. He took up the pose that Iroh taught him, while focusing on the output of his quirk like yin. Golden lightning began to spark from his fingers as he kept control before he began to move like how Iroh taught him. His fingers trailed circles in the sky, lightning beginning to trail behind his movements and follow tightly around him. He focused on the target in front of him set up by Ectoplasm's clone, unaware that a few students had looked at him in awe at seeing lightning dance around his body. He breathed as his hand rested in front of him, closing his eyes as he concentrated before snapping them open and swiftly striking forward. Crockum! A bolt of lightning shot out of his index and middle fingers, striking a cliff and blasting a chunk of it out, leaving a scorched and smoldering crater behind. Better, but I can still be more precise. Denki thought to himself as he observed the damage. Hearing approaching footsteps, he spoke with Ectoplasm, who complimented his accuracy and control and tried to give a few tips. Nearby, Kyoka observed Denki doing his martial arts and became intrigued, so she walked over to them, making sure to stay in Denki's line of sight. He was jumpy if someone approached from behind, and signed for him to teach her. Really? Yes. It looks interesting. Who knows? Maybe it can help me with my quirk. All right then. After quickly explaining to the Ectoplasm clones, who agreed to stand by and observe, Denki began to slowly trace through the movements of the kata, explaining to her with a soft voice step by step. Kyoka found it oddly endearing. Denki was usually scatterbrained, to say the least. He had troubles focusing during class. Although he had a passion for literature and a natural intuition for anything involving electricity, it was extremely easy for him to lose focus. But it was moments like these, where he had such a soft intensity in his eyes, the intrinsic desire and drive to improve himself, to control his power. There was a time, shortly after Island, when she saw him snap for the first time, that she had actually been afraid of him. However, due to their shared experience, she decided to take the first step and get to know him better. She'd also done research on the side of the behavioral aspects of elemental quirks, and actually discovered a lot about those with electricity-based quirks, habits, tendencies, etc. Some applied to Denki, a few were extremely off the mark. A few, she may or may not have wondered if it was true. Do kisses really feel like sparks going down your spine? She flushed as she caught her train of thought and shook her head, focusing on the matter at hand. The two flowed in unison, their movements slowly synchronizing. Unknown to them, some of the others in the training area paused as their attention was caught by the duo. Even Aizawa, who would normally scold them for being distracted, was interested by the spectacle. It seemed like they were dancing in unison, and it also appeared that they were subconsciously using their quirks in unison as well. Lightning began to spark from Denki's fingers, and their air began to fill with static. Kyoka's heart began to beat, the dulcet tones surging through her, and they could feel the thrumming beneath their feet. It was very beautiful, seeing the two souls work together with such synergy. Almost subconsciously, they decided on the same target, the same wall that Denki had hit earlier. Finally, they moved into the last repetition of the kata. One foot back, the other forward. Their respective fingers trailed a circle in front of each other, Lightning wreathing his hand, and hers was visually distorted from the sound waves traveling in her hand. Their respective offhands briefly showed the same before they pushed out, hands splayed in opposite directions. It was beautiful. Denki's golden lightning and Kyoka's pulsing sound waves. Their fingers were not strictly parallel with each other, which meant that their attacks met in the middle first. Denki's lightning went from a vibrant gold to a brilliant blue, the same energy rippling as it traced Kyoka's sound waves. A small bubble of energy erupted at the nexus before the energy pulsed forward. Electric blue and white streaking through the air and striking the target first. It sheared a hole straight through, the surrounding concrete melting from the intense heat. A mere heartbeat later, the sound waves caught up, delivering an energized payload that obliterated the rest of the wall, practically turning it into dust. It was then that the noise hit them all. Crack-a-boom. The silence that followed the roar was deafening. Breach, who had seen the display of power and sheer destruction, looked down at one of his doomsday rounds and quietly went back to his corner to mope. Tenya was speechless, not noticing his glasses falling from his face and cracking against the ground, while Ochako, who had used her quirk on herself, didn't notice she was floating towards the ceiling slowly. Momo gawked at the destroyed cliff, the cannon she had been in the middle of making currently sticking out of her, while Mineta, who was using his quirk to scale the tallest cliff, was slowly losing his grip on the giant grape he was grasping. Itsuka, Bondo, and Tsuburaba, who had gotten into an accident with the glue-dispensing boy's quirk, also just looked at the spectacle, not noticing how the glue was slowly hardening around them. The silence was suddenly broken by the sound of clapping and laughter, with several heads turning their heads towards the source of the new sound. The group turned to a widely smiling Izuku, who was beaming at the duo. "That's it. I knew you could do it," he said, soon followed by another laugh. That seemed to kick things off, as the students began to crowd around the duo, teasing and cajoling them over their new technique. As they did that, however, the teachers actually gathered together and discussed something from what they observed. After all, Might entered the training ground. "He's smiling. It's been a while since I've seen him smile like that," he observed sadly. The teachers stared at each other, recalling Izuku the last few months. "You're right. Last time I saw his smile reach his eyes was before Django," Midnight softly said. "It feels like it's been so long, but it's only been a few months." Cementos commented in turn. "We've seen him smile, but," Midnight replied, trailing off as she stared at the smiling boy. "They're tired smiles, badly hiding exhaustion and grief." Aizawa finished, noting his own observations. "Sometimes, he looks like he's at the end of his rope." He looked like him. The thought passed through the others, but was unspoken. It did not need to be. From the reports, Kaminari and Jairu were instrumental in restoring one of Izuku's fragments. It makes sense that he would be invested in their progress, especially since he won't be participating in this cycle. Not conventionally, at least. Aizawa muttered. "Although, I suppose the extra moral support will be good for them. And the lessons to be learned," he thought to himself. While the teachers discussed amongst themselves, someone landed outside of the training ground and approached them, before they cleared their throat, getting the attention of anyone within ear range. It was Night Owl. "Mom? What are you doing all the way out at U.A?" Itsuka asked as she skipped over to the taller woman, who gently ruffled her daughter's hair. "Simply to thank Wheeljack and see how my little girl and her friends are doing," she answered, taking off her helmet while patting the holster on her hip, which Itsuka noticed held one of her guns. This one, however, seemed a bit different. "Mom, what's up with your pistol?" the redhead asked as Bo smiled yet again and pulled it out of its holster, revealing a boxy and rectangular pistol before she pointed it at a rock and fired it. Chew! A yellow blaster bolt flew out of it and impacted the rock, leaving a smoking hole along with a burn mark. The display caused everyone to gawk at it, despite the fact they all had seen blasters at this point. Itsuka quickly grasped her mom by the arms and started to shake her back and forth. "How did you get your hands on blaster tech? Did you steal it? Please tell me you didn't steal it, or worse, took it from one of the droids," she yelled in a panicked tone, before Bo gently chopped her on the head. "Relax, Itsuka. That's why I'm here to thank Wheeljack. He was the one who gave me blueprints to the basics on blasters so our agency could make our own as a token of friendship between the Cry's agency and the VOD," she replied with a soft grin. Izuku walked up to her and shook her hand. "Glad to see it being put to good use," he commented. "It's good to see you again, Night Owl." "And to you as well, Mandalore," she replied while Wheeljack came over, currently tinkering with an invention of his. Most likely something he, Dust, and May had cooked up. "I see the gift is well appreciated?" the ARC trooper asked, to which Bo nodded and smiled. "They're much easier to use than my old guns, and once you've got the finer details down, they're easy to make, and the stun setting has made the life of my sidekicks a lot easier when it comes to just apprehending villains and crooks," she nodded at him, before turning it so the barrel faced her and handed it over to the scientist so he could investigate it. Scanning it with his helmet, Wheeljack hummed and nodded before handing it back. "I see. You sacrificed rate of fire for more punch behind each shot. Clever for armored foes and for longer distances since the bolt's power will last a longer travel time," he said. While the two struck up a conversation, most of them went back to honing their skills and coming up with super moves of their own. At the other side of the gym, most of the 1B students were getting back on track from their brief distraction, though a few were jealous that Kaminari and Jairu managed to do some kind of combined super move. They were instead all the more motivated to create something that defined them. Something that wasn't really noticed, however, by the class, was the strange lack of reaction by Monoma. Truth be told, they'd noticed that he'd been quiet recently, ever since the camp. Though they chalked it up to the severity of the situation, many of them still did not like talking about what had happened and how many lives had been lost protecting them. They all remembered what had happened when they had returned to campus, when they met up with Melissa again. Her question of where so many of the people she had made friends with back at Island were. "Guys, I just got the news. Is everyone all right?" Melissa frantically asked as she breached the doors into the hospital floor where everyone was being treated. "Melissa," Ochako whispered, relieved to see that she was safe. They had been worried that the villains would have tried to attack other places at the same time to stretch U.A's forces, but it seemed that the camp was the only location. The two girls hugged each other tightly, though Melissa could see that Ochako, and many others for that matter, had been traumatized by what had occurred. "Ochako, what happened?" Melissa asked. She began to tremble as the night's events began to crash down on her. "We were attacked. The League, they used these robots, droids against us. Izuku's been captured and so many of the VOD are gone." She wept. Looking around, the blonde girl scanned the room for all of the wounded, students, clones, everyone. "Where's Noble?" Monoma could still remember the scream she had let out after hearing that the only thing they had found was a severed hand and his cracked helmet. He tried to ignore his own guilt, even as it festered beneath him. "It's not my fault. If we hadn't been so many, we wouldn't have been targeted." "Yes, that's it," he thought to himself, despite knowing just how much of a bullshit excuse that sounded like, even to himself. The fact that he didn't even bother to learn the other man's name, and only found out after his passing. He gulped heavily as he tried to focus, borrowed powers surging beneath his hands. Borrowed. Never his own. He snarled as he smacked the concrete before wincing and shaking his hand. Then there was the other matter. Thorn. He thought to himself. He wouldn't lie. He didn't exactly like the clone guy out of principle. Even more so after he started to date Kendo, which, to be fair, was really weird for him. It didn't really help the fact that he himself also had been charmed by the redhead at the time. But that was before he realized that the clones were more than clones. And Thorn had been a good man, and would have been a good friend had he given him the chance. Come on, Monoma. Give them a shot. You might even surprise yourself. Setsuna once told him. Would you stop acting like that already? It's childish, not to mention quirkist of you. Awase had sighed in disappointment at one point. Do you really think they asked to be attacked by villains during their first week here? People died, man. He remembered even Tsubiraba telling him off. Have to say, bro, it wasn't exactly manly of you to make jabs at his late brothers like that. Yes, I did try to punch him, but he spiked me back tenfold for that. Tetsu's voice rang through his head. Look, Monoma, I don't care what you think about me, but I do understand that you care about your friends and classmates. You're not so slick that you can hide that from me, he remembers Thorn saying to him one day. We're only here to help you all. Hopefully, one day you can realize that. Those words had resonated in his head ever since he heard them, but he had chosen to bury them beneath his jealousy and competitive spirit against his sister class. They rang stronger than ever now, however, especially with the blurry images he saw of the CLO hero in training taking on a dozen enemies by himself. Monoma. Hey, Monoma. The blonde was snapped out of his train of thought by the voice of Rin, who was standing and looking at him with a worried expression. You good? You've been glaring at that cliff for 5 minutes now like it killed your pet poodle, he said, while Monoma shook his head.
Infine.
Just some bad memories from my childhood. He half lied as he focused back on the powers currently circulating through his system. He had somehow managed to touch the Pomeranian without getting murdered, along with the Ice Prince of Class 1A and Bakugu and Todoroki. He blinked as he heard a familiar voice in the back of his mind. He looked around, swearing that he heard Thorn for a moment before shaking his head as the words rang in his head for a bit. Bakugu and Todoroki. They were fellow students. They deserved to be called by their names, not descriptors, even in the sanctity of his mind. He may antagonize 1A, but he refused to debase himself like that Bakugo hooligan who didn't even bother remembering names. He was better than that, and he wasn't so absorbed by his pride that he at least bothered to try and remember them. Still, though, he hoped he wasn't going insane. As he went back to training, he lifted his palm and let out a small explosion. Not exactly something that would be able to demolish anything, but certainly concussive force. He stared at his hands once more before shaking his head and focusing. He had work to do. Trying out the half-hot, half-cold quirk, he first created some ice and then some fire, before attempting to do both at the same time. I can at least try and do something he can't with his own quirk, he muttered. He didn't realize that someone else was staring at him with narrowed eyes, also suspicious of his behavior. Something wrong, dear? Itsuka heard and turned to her mother. No, it's nothing. Just one of my classmates has me concerned. You mean the guy who didn't like your future husband? She asked, to which her daughter flushed red for a brief moment before calming down. Both slightly grimaced. Her daughter had unfortunately inherited her stubbornness when it came to feelings, and hadn't properly grieved Thorn yet, instead shoving it down. She hoped that by bringing it up, it would either make her explode and grieve, or B, make her contemplate and grieve. So far she hadn't had much luck. Yes, that guy. He has been awfully quiet lately. He would normally be in the middle of boasting about our class being the best thing since sliced bread, right about now, along with his essay of insults towards 1A. Bo looked over at the blonde boy. To be frank, she didn't like him one bit, considering how he had spoken about her late son-in-law, but if her daughter worried about him, then he had to have some good qualities about him. Tell me about him. Well, he was arrogant and stubborn about every little thing and always ramped up the rivalry between the classes. He never thought before thinking, and he was so disrespectful of Midoriya, the clones, Thorn. She snarled before shaking her head and pinching the bridge of her nose. But he motivated the class. always cheered everyone on. For those whose quirks he could copy, he would work with them, trying to figure out new things outside the box to help them out in the long run. Yes, he's an idiot, insensitive, and a jerk. But he's one. B's idiotic, insensitive jerk, she sighed, rubbing her eyes slightly over the things she had to deal with. Yes, he was a rift between the two classes, but he was still a fellow student. I see. So he's a good strategist. However, he has a huge inferiority complex and tries to use it to bring others up. That's about it, yes. So he's essentially the opposite of the Bakugo kid? Itsuka snorted as they looked over to Bakugo, who for once was actually quiet. Even he didn't dare to speak against the hero who helped take down Maul. To be fair, however, he was currently focusing on his own super move. The explosive blonde was standing on top of one of the cliffs, a wall in front of him. Thrusting his arms out, he formed a ring on top of his palm with his left hand, before concentrating the energy from his explosions on that one spot. AP shot, he bellowed, before releasing the energy which came out in a beam that cut straight through the rocks with the same ease a blaster shot through concrete. Haha, not impressed. We can do that too. Breach shouted from a distance. Shut up, you. Bakugo shouted back, just as the now-hold rock started to tilt before falling, right towards Tashinori.
Oi.
Watch out. Bakugo screamed, just as the slab of concrete was about to flatten the emaciated former number one. It was stopped by something rushing in and holding it up. Upon closer look, it was another clone. However, his armor was different. The first and most notable thing was the fact that it was bigger and bulkier, with several extra layers of armor around the chest area, along with the helmet and neck being better protected by the collar and shoulder armor. On the back was something that looked like boosters, something that was confirmed by the smoke emitting from them, while a tube of some sort was sticking out of the right arm. Throwing away the slab of concrete, the clone glared up at Bakugo before he started to walk away after dusting off Tashinori. Looking after the trooper, ideas began to spring up in the former wielder of One for All's head, but decided to save those thoughts for later. Turning around, he saw Izuku stare right at him, their noses close enough to almost touch. Ah. You've got to be more careful, Beer. Izuku, when did you get here? As soon as that rock started to fall, I moved, but I noticed the trooper coming, so I let him deal with it, Izuku said, and Tashinori noticed how the dark saber was in his hand. Oh, well, thank you, my boy. By the way, what kind of trooper was that? He asked his adoptive son, who was about to answer before getting interrupted.
Oi.
All Might, don't just stand around and do nothing. Pay attention or stay out of the way. Bakugo screamed with a slight explosion from the cliff he was on. Well, he's as amicable as ever. And that's Blaze Trooper, based off the armor that Grid wore during Kamino. But less. Overcompensating, as you can see. Don't know where the little guy got the bright idea of stuffing all of those accessories on the suit, he said, before he looked back up at Bakugo and pinched his nose slightly. Maybe if you had checked if anyone had been in the way before blasting, this wouldn't have happened. That wasn't my fault, and you know it. Oh? You mean like all the times where you threw my stuff to the carps back at junior high? He deadpanned. Kaboom. DKU. Tashinori merely sighed. Still though, Bakugo's words rang in his head. Now that he wasn't All Might, what could he do? Over on another side of the training area, various students were focusing on their super moves as well. Dark Shadow, Tokoyami cried out. Right? The sentient quirk called out as she went into action. Tokoyami was then enshrouded by his quirk, giving him more protection and striking capability. Behold, abyssal black body, he said, to which the stealth troopers currently observing him clapped their hands. Well, all of them except Cutter, who still was missing half of his left arm after the incident at the forest camp. Impressive, Fumigage. Most impressive. It's good, Midnight began. But you should shorten the name to something a bit easier to say. Super moves need to be clear and concise both for field work and publicity. Oh, I have an idea. Me too. I got one. Tokoyami was then barraged by suggestions, and Midnight laughed at how flustered he became from the sudden attention. All of the clones around him, who so happened to also be Chunis to some degree, came up with names such as Phantom Cloak, Abyss Body, Black Hole, and Demon King. The last one being shot down by midnight faster than Bakugu could shout die. Guys, I already have a backup, Black Ink, Tokoyami said dramatically, to much cheering from the others. All except Cutter, who seemed to be down in the gutter. What's the matter, my brother in darkness? Tokoyami asked the one-armed clone who looked at him briefly before sighing. Just wondering what the hell's taking so long making my prosthetic. Sure, I may not be a lefty, but it's still annoying only having one hand to work with, the clone said as he waved around his hand. It was a simple prosthetic, one to get him used to the weight of what was being commissioned for him, rudimentary movement capabilities, and wasn't really tied into his nerves like the prosthetics of today. He was currently waiting for the new one, and Recovery Girl said that she'd schedule him a surgery with some of her associates to get it properly attached. You do realize that it will be quite some time before you return to active duty, yes? Yeah, I know that, but the sooner the better, you know? I do. Come, let us join the others. We must practice more, Tokoyami said as he moved back to the clones and started to practice using Black Ink. Sighing once again, Cutter followed the bird-headed teenager who put a comforting arm around his shoulder. While the group of shadow troopers went back to being edgelords, another clone was currently taking a nap, his face covered by a magazine while quiet snore emitting from him as he kept on sleeping through the entire racket taking place all around him. Well, he was sleeping until Keely came over and pushed him off of his ledge using his foot. Wawuha, he muttered as he looked around, before his head turned to his brother who looked at him slightly disappointed.
Yang?
You know that if you want to sleep, you should do it at night like we all do instead of reading all night long, he sighed before helping him up. I know you love your books and history, but you seriously shouldn't end up becoming like a salaryman in terms of your schedule. Plus, if you're too tired, how will you use that great brain of yours? Sorry, but I can't help myself when it comes to books, you know? There is so much to learn from history, plus I don't really want to use what knowledge I gather for warfare, you know? Knowledge should be used wisely instead of things like these. Yang replied as he stretched slightly and popped his neck, before the both of them heard a noise and looked towards it. The one the sound had belonged to was the one and only R2-D2 who slid towards the clone duo while being equipped with a tray holding glasses with different non-alcoholic beverages, before he stopped in front of them and extended 2 paper cups of tea, something which they accepted gladly. Thank you, R2. I must say, having you and 3PO here have been an interesting experience, but not a bad one if I do say so myself. Keely nodded while the astromech just chirped in what sounded like a happy tone. Sipping his tea, Yang put a hand on R2's dome-shaped head and patted it gently while he looked at the students in training and their brothers. It has only been a few months, and yet we have seen more conflict than most people our age have combined, he commented as an explosion rang out on the training ground, courtesy of Bakugu performing another super move. Contemplating over what his more peaceful but tactical-minded brother said, Keely let out a small sigh and looked at him. That may be the harsh truth, VOD, but we all knew what we signed up for when we decided to leave the mindscape, and I don't regret it one bit.
Neither do I VOB, neither do I.
I'm actually here to help you out, Mandalore. I brought someone who can really help you with your Sarisu, Bo-Katan said as she walked over to them. Really? Izuku perked up. Who? Bo-Katan sighed. It had been a pain in the ass convincing him to come, but when he asked her why she was so desperate, because I see children about to take the same path I did, and I do not want that for them. You've changed, Bo. I needed to. Itsuka almost lost me. I don't want to lose her, or for her loved ones to go through the same pain we did. Sigh, I understand you wanting to help Itsuka, but why the boy? I owe him a debt. Very well. A robed figure approached them, Izuka's eyes widening in recognition. Hello there, the bearded man said with a small grin. Allow me to introduce Dash, the negotiator. Izuku interrupted in awe. The international diplomat hero. You've been instrumental in establishing multiple treaties with different countries, sometimes single-handedly stopping wars before they could begin. You were even on the World Heroes Council as their youngest member before retiring for a home life. Can I have your autograph? Bo-Katan was finally treated to the sight of her brother-in-law, losing his composure as now just about every student was looking at him in awe. She chuckled much to his chagrin. Still, ever the negotiator, he was quick to rein himself in. Well then, it seems that my reputation precedes me. Although I must say that you have some impressive feats to your own name, young Mandalore. Izuku was actually feeling giddy at being recognized by such a well-established hero before catching himself and bowing. I would be honored to learn under you, he somewhat shyly said. If you are as diligent a student as I've been told, the honor will be mine. However, Tashinori says, I do not believe that all is lost. For as my light fades, a new light arises. A new hope? Tensei woke up feeling very refreshed yet also slightly exhausted. A somewhat unique feeling that came with being dunked in Bacta, apparently. It was a feeling that he had become used to since he'd started the treatments. He sighed in his bed, as the doctors fussed over him. On the other side of the room was his family. By the Bacta chamber was a metaclone taking some readings from it. All right then, Ida-san, let's move you over, another clone said as he grabbed the sheets and moved his feet. Tensei gasped and jolted. Everyone froze. Tensei? His mother shakily asked in concern, a hand reaching out toward her boy. Tensei swallowed thickly, wondering if it was his mind playing tricks on him. Do that again? He pleaded softly, the sheer desperation and hope in his voice striking them all. The clone nodded solemnly and grabbed the sheets underneath his feet before moving them slightly. Tensei gasped and trembled, tears pooling in his eyes. Tensei? His father asked with more hope. I felt that, he shakily whispered with a grin, sniffling a bit since he was quickly going to lose what composure he had. I felt that. His family began to crowd around him in joy, and he quickly found his head muffled under a trio of bodies, tears and laughter filling the room. Tenya could only hold on to his brother, glad that his hope was being fulfilled. The road of recovery would still be a long ways away, but now there was a chance. Ingenium and Cabber would run together once more. The clone smiled softly underneath his helmet, glad to see the family so happy. This is what they needed to see after such harrowing times. Izuku would be happy to receive the news, and so would Waxer and Boyle. And although we will face trials, both from our enemies and from within ourselves, Izuku has been contemplating many things recently. He felt that some of the decisions he had made recently had been less than stellar, especially with Kamino and the Forest of Beasts. Were they right to actually take more lives than they had? Could they have saved more than they did at Kamino? What if he went down the wrong path? His brothers were a veritable army with unmatched technology, meaning that if that happened, Japan would be beneath their boots within months, maybe even weeks. He wasn't trying to sound arrogant, but the truth was that no hero could withstand that level of firepower, especially if it came by surprise. And looking at what the support department inside of his head had come up with recently in terms of cloaking, he knew that they could go through with it if needed. I don't want to be the one who restarts the Japanese empire, he muttered to himself as he looked down at his hands, who were trembling slightly at the mere thought of becoming a conqueror if he took just one wrong step. He'd also heard about the inner Izuku inside of him, the one that refused to fuse again. Lord Mandalore. If he managed to take over, then he could only imagine what would happen. None of it was pretty. Humph. Izuku blinked, the sudden harumph making him pause. Upon hearing nothing else, he focused on his conversation with Hound Dog. Now, Midoriya, Hound Dog said, there's something that I wanted to go over with you. Could you tell me about your father? Izuku went cold, his mouth clamping shut as a sudden fury swelled through him. Hound Dog's eyes slightly widened in surprise as he swore that he saw Midoriya's flash yellow. He took a deep breath through his nose, Hound Dog observing every moment. Izuku shook his head. And no, he bit out. I'm sorry, Sensei, but right now, I can't. Easy, Midoriya. Hound Dog gently interrupted. Remember, we're taking this step by step. After his initial interview with Hound Dog after the USJ, Izuku had been an infrequent visitor to the schools first. He had refused to do anything involving therapy, but eventually, after hearing the testimonies from his brothers, had decided to return. Hound Dog had been gently prodding at Izuku to talk about his father, one of the touchiest topics that swelled within the young boy. Among other things they discussed frequently, such as Eri, him dealing with the deaths of his brothers, even Shigaraki and Toga. Midoriya Hisashi remained the one elusive figure that he could never get Izuku to open up about. All right then, in that case, I have another question in mind. Izuku blinked before nodding. Midoriya, in all the time that we've been speaking together, there's still one thing that's left me confused. Hound Dog said, slightly trailing off. What's that, sensei? Your relationship with Eri, he bluntly stated before raising a hand to stop any protests. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with it, but it must be said, you've taken a great responsibility on you, Izuku. And to be frank, you could have easily slid into the role of an older brother, yet you decided to take upon yourself the burden of a father. Izuku gulped, a small, yet quickly expanding guilt developing in the pit of his stomach. I must ask why? Why did you do it? And before you answer, I want you to look deep inside yourself and answer me why. Hound Dog said with a stern heaviness in his voice. Izuku choked back his response and shamefully looked away from him. He didn't need to do an introspection. He already knew the truth. Keeping his head bowed, he stared at the scars that littered his hands, scars that he'd seen on hers, fear that was in her eyes, and that was once his own. He remembered her nightmares and the names she would whisper out in fear. And he remembered the name that he would whisper through his own nightmares. He stared ahead, though, because at the end of the day, because I'm selfish, we can look forward to new beginnings, a new chapter in our collective lives. The wedding was a simple affair. Only their closest friends had attended, those being Nizu, Chio, Tsukachi, Gran Torino, Dave and Melissa from Toshinori's end. Mitsuki and Masaru ended up coming for Inko, though due to increasing tensions, Katsuki was not told about the event, unlikely as it was that he would come anyway. Izuku was glad. There was still too much bad blood between them, and he didn't want to ruin the moment. Izuku had walked his mother down the aisle, holding on to her tightly but with joy for his glowing mother. Ochako actually ended up coming with Izuku, and the two were holding Eri's hands as they observed the proceedings. Toshinori spoke his vows and his love, the same with Inko before they both began to repeat a phrase.
Mi solus tome, mi solus dartome, mi medinuian, mi bajur verde.
We are one when together, we are one when parted. We will share all. We will raise warriors. The two gently kissed, and Izuku felt warm inside. Nana was crying apparently, tears of joy of course, but she was weeping. He chuckled to himself as he saw Gran Torino shakily wipe away some tears from his eyes. The old man had a content smile on his face. The reception was also simple, and Izuku was glad that there was no media presence. He basked in his mother's happiness as she danced the night away with Toshinori, though he managed a few dances with her and Ochako as well. Later, as the night receded, he found himself with Toshinori on a balcony. Still wish that you guys had told me earlier, but I'm glad that we're able to have this moment of peace and actually enjoy it, Izuku said as he nursed a drink in his hand. Indeed, again I apologize. We meant to tell you before, but with everything happening, I understand, Izuku replied as Toshinori trailed off. They remained there for a moment in silent contemplation, as Izuku recalled other things that were discussed in their previous meeting about the different villains they'd encountered and their plans for dealing with them. He huffed through his nose as he contemplated the decision that he was about to make, weighing everything that had happened and everything they'd been told. One chance, he finally decided. Toshinori hummed in confusion. Shigaraki, Izuku muttered, almost forcing the next few words out. I will give him one honest chance. He then turned to face Toshinori, his eyes bearing into his. Out of respect to you and Nana, I will give him one honest chance to change, to free himself from all for one and his current path. Izuku, Toshinori whispered in shock. If he doesn't, though? Izuku's eyes turned cold and Toshinori shivered. He's going to die. But in the end, I have hope that the future will remain bright as it is upheld not only by a pillar, but by a foundation. Toshinori walked up to his son and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The two observed Izuku's classmates enter the buses that would lead them to the exam center. They'll be all right, Toshinori comforted. I know, Izuku stated, confident in the abilities of his friends. Well, a part of me wishes that I didn't have to lie to them, that they could be more prepared for what's coming. If they're even half as stubborn as you, problem child, then they'll pass with flying colors, Aizawa said as he approached them. Everything's set into place, including what the commission asked of you. Izuku didn't like it, not one bit, especially after recent events. But the commission had made some actual good arguments. It wasn't only his classmates in danger. Any hero who went to the front lines was at risk and needed to be prepared. He only hoped that his friends would forgive him for keeping this a secret. Ochako led the class forward, Itsuka doing the same for their sister class. It was an odd feeling, one that she didn't fully realize, but it appeared that their class, barring Bakugo, looked to her as the de facto leader whenever Izuku wasn't here. She had protested, saying that it should go for Tinya. He was the vice president, after all. Surprisingly enough, it was Tinya who denied it. Such titles do not mean anything outside of the classroom. This is as close to real life as we're going to get, and you've already demonstrated your leadership capabilities multiple times, Ochako, Tinya firmly stated. Ochako blinked in surprise, but nodded then. She patted her hip. Izuku had been training her in the use of the Darksaber recently, in case he ever needed to relinquish it once more. And with Melissa's help, the cylinder was a comforting weight, but also heavy. Not in weight, but in responsibility. She was among the first to be granted such a gift, and her eyes glanced over at Momo, who nodded at her in return. Any words of encouragement, Mandalore Uravity? Mina said with a grin as she approached. Don't sigh. She didn't like the title too much. It was extremely heavy to bear. Not to mention it felt slightly wrong, probably because of how it was Izuku's hero name. All right, everyone, this is our chance. Izuku's gotten his license, and because of that he's able to go out and actually do good. This is our chance to join him, just like he wants us to. So let's do our best and come back home. Koyasii, she roared. Oya.
Plus ultra.
Oi!
What's with that battle cry? The group turned in apprehension, seeing a large student in a shiketsu uniform with a shocked and slightly crazed expression. Who are you? Author. And that's a wrap. Glad to finally be back from my. Expect these intermittent hiatus as I go out to sea every now and then. Deployment will be even worse. Still not sure what I'm going to do when that comes. I hope that you've all enjoyed this chapter. Before we head out again, I'll make sure to bring out a few more chapters, one-shots, DLC, etc. I do have a few OMACs though. Realist AU. Basically a small O where Izuku's a quirkless hero/musician who takes up a protege in a younger Jairu. Kyoka flushed, wondering if they liked her beats. Yeah, Zuka's gonna love this. The hero on the other side of the table said, I'm the realist in the business and everybody gon' be envious of my beginnings. Got a circus full of sinners with bodies, so stop trying to be another edition. 'Cause I'm the realist in the business and everybody gon' be envious of my beginnings. Got a circus full of sinners with bodies, so stop trying to be another edition. The class nodded their heads along as they listened to Kyoka's song. The number 5 hero, Sentinel, had taken her under his wing for her internship and they collaborated on a song, much to her joy. Guess I've really got no right to complain much. Japan's been good to me, huh? But when they say I'm only top 5 'cause I'm quirkless, why would I be stunned? My stat is still working against me. What? 'Cause second I should be to none. No quirk ain't why they put me at 5. Nope. It's why they can't put me at 1. Who? Author. And yeah, I honestly can't come up with more lyrics. Just a nice little thing inspired by Eminem and Easy Mill's song Realist. Credit goes to them. If Legion met canon. You absolute dumbass. Everyone in the vicinity blinked as they turned to where Mandalore, Izuku, both All Mights and Kaken were grouped together. What? Izuku stuttered out. Why, out of everyone, would you tell him about One for All? Mandalore began to seethe, a fury boiling under his skin. I thought that he deserved to know. Deserved to know? Mandalore asked incredulously. What has he ever done to deserve anything from you? I thought dash.
No.
Mandalore barked and Izuku flinched back. You didn't think. You just held on to a worthless idea and risked everything for someone unworthy. Who else could I tell? Izuku tried to justify. Who else? Who else? Mandalore asked. Ochako, Tenya, Momo, Denki, Kyoka, Yuga, Melissa. Hell, I would have accepted Monoma of all people rather than him. Any one of those people are far more trustworthy than Bakugo. Izuku flinched back again, left wondering what exactly happened between the two, especially since their version of Kaken didn't come with them to this strange world.
Oi.
DKU2, stop your complaining and dash. Bam! Katsuki crashed against the wall brutally, one for all flaring across Mandalore's armor, his expressionless helmet somehow conveying a furious glare. Here we go, Jake Kara muttered, Ochako turning towards her in confusion.
What?
I'm honestly surprised it took this long. I have tolerated many things from you, Bakugo, but I refuse to be called by that name again. Izuku blinked in shock, wondering what changed. DKU. I'm going to kill GURK. In the blink of an eye, no faster, Bakugo was already folded over Mandalore's fist. He's fast, Izuku thought in shock. Faster than me. Always so arrogant, always so prideful, all because you think yourself the strongest when you're nothing more than a raging bull, a bully still shackled by his pride. Mandalore declared as he practically began to manhandle Bakugo, grabbing him by the back of his shirt before tossing him back. The other teen didn't even have a chance to breathe, let alone fight back as Mandalore began to toss him around. Is he really supposed to be one of your 3 strongest people? Sheesh. Just how far behind are we here? Another voice called out in the distance, before she turned her head and looked down the street to see 2 figures walking towards them. Looking at the figures as they stepped into the streetlight, she noticed they wore practically identical armor. Those weird skirt things around their hips and the same helmet, with the only differences being the colors and patterns of their armor, along with some of the gear they wore on their arms and armor. Hey Burinar, Beslar, do I even want to know what Bakugo did to warrant this? Beslar asked, the voice definitely being feminine although unidentifiable due to something in the helmet scrambling the voice. Called him Deca too, Jake Kara replied. The 2 winced in unison. Yeah, that'll do it. This won't be pretty, Burinar said, the helmet doing the same to his voice. What's wrong with that name? Ochako shakily asked, unable to tear her eyes off of the spectacle. HM? I guess that Deku is different for you guys. Your Izuku made it his hero name after all, but our Izuku absolutely hates that name. The yellow-armored individual replied. Oh. Ochako winced as she looked back at the fight. If the one-sided beatdown could even be called that. Yep. Beslar finished as she stood next to Burinar. The brutal fight, if it could be called that, ended quickly with Bakugo under Mandalore's foot, the latter looming over him. Ah, now this is a familiar sight. Ochako noticed the others tense at Mandalore's slight change of voice, as if they were also readying themselves for a fight. The great, he said mockingly, sarcasm dripping with every word. Bakugo Katsuki under my feet. It just goes to show, I guess, no matter what the universe, you remain the same, spiteful boy who's nothing more than a villain hiding behind a license. Many of the unarmored individuals gasped, unwilling to believe that Midoriya Izuku, even from another universe, would ever declare Bakugo a villain. Bakugo tried to get up, but the pressure on him was unbearable. Give up, Bakugo, Mandalore stated. You're no hero. You never will be a GH. Mandalore went rocketing into another wall and then through it, his helmet clattering on the floor as Izuku stood in front of a coughing Bakugo. That's enough. I don't care who you are or what you say. Kaken will become one of the best heroes there is. The other green-haired teenager yelled in defiance, one for all sparking around him as full cowl was activated. Bakugo coughed. Damn it, Deku. I didn't need your help. All the armored figures, however, cringed in a mix of fear, nervousness, and phantom pain. This is not gonna be pretty, Jake Kara said as she shook her head. What? Ochako said before turning to a flaring Mandalore who angrily stood up. the red veins pulsating across the X-shaped scar adorning his face, making her gasp out in fear as he worked his way out of the rubble. Disgusting. To hear those words come out of my own mouth, Mandalore said as he spat out blood. Fine then. If you want to be so naive, then I'll just beat that naivety out of you. The moment the words had left the armored Izuku's mouth, Burinar had begun to lift his right arm, only for Jake Kara to stop him and shook her head at him, the visor obscuring her face while he slowly lowered his arm, the unarmored student only now noticing the dart retracting back into the vambrace on his arm. It was bound to happen. Let them get it out of their system, she sighed as she looked at the trio, her tinted visor somehow managing to convey a grimace while Beslar put a hand on her twins' shoulder and repeated the motion the pink armored woman had done. Looking at the ground, Burinar sighed before nodding. In a flash, Mandalore was already on top of Izuku, the latter barely able to get his arms up in a guard to block his counterpart's kick and being launched back into the wall. Ack! Quickly recovering, he lashed out with a punch that was easily dodged. Slow. Another wild haymaker. Sloppy. A roundhouse kick.
Sad.
Izuku leaped back and up, impacting the large ceiling before coming down with a large axe kick. Manchester smash. The kick slammed into the ground, but Mandalore dodged. You'd think you'd learn. A hand slammed into Izuku's chest, knocking the breath out of him as he was then dragged. You're still too linear, Mandalore shouted as he reared his fist back, ready to knock his counterpart 6 ways to Sunday. A ping from Danger Sense made him leap back, just in time to avoid the explosion from Bakugo. Oh, damn it, Deku. You really can't do anything without me. Kakin. Ah, well then. Mandalore cracked his neck. Shall we begin? Author. Extended fight to be done in extended one-shot. Detroit smash. Izuku's fist lashed out towards Mandalore, the latter catching it, the resulting force displacing air between them as the ground cracked underneath them. Slam. Mandalore then twisted his arm, making the other boy gasp in pain. KGH. Izuku retched at the fist harshly impacted against his stomach, the force traveling through his body so much that a few could see the impact from his back. He fell to his knees as blood and bile hit the ground. I admit, you have heart, Izuku. Mandalore snarled before slamming his fist onto the boy's back, crashing him down. Ack. But as long as you remain shackled to the past, you can never hope to defeat me. Rolling the boy with his foot, Mandalore glared at him. And as far as I'm concerned, Deku will never be the name of a hero, he stated before glaring coldly at him. But it remains an apt name for you. Mandalore then stepped off him before walking away only to hear a shuffle. He paused and turned to glare at the shakily standing Izuku, the latter stumbling on his feet, his face bruised and bloody, but he still stood up. Now I know how Bakugo feels about the sports festival. My Deku means the hero who can do it. I will beat you. The boy was trembling, but he still stood up and faced him while glaring with one eye. Mandalore glared at him, eyes burning. Insolence. He moved. Author. I have more ideas, but I'll save those for one-shots and stuff. Thank you all for your patience. Like I said, this isn't abandoned, just gonna be longer due to my duties. Chapter 38. Holiday Interlude. Happy holidays, everyone. Considering the timeline, consider this taking place after Overhaul and the Culture Festival but before the joint training arc. It was calm, and that was something that was desperately needed after everything that occurred. Christmas had already passed, there were still fried chicken leftovers, everyone spending time with their families. But they'd all agreed to have a celebration for the holidays and the new year. It was quite the ruckus really, all 40 students, plus a few extras. He'd been drawn to near tears when Nizu had arrived with Isabi, teachers, and some of the VOD. The majority of the VOD had their own dinner over in the barracks. It was chaotic, frantic, and sometimes stressful, but it was home. It was family. He found himself on a balcony, looking out toward the setting sun. A slight wind passed by, and he shivered. While he enjoyed this time of year, he was starting to dislike the weather a bit. It made his scars ache. Izuku? He turned to face Ochako and smiled softly at her. What's up, sire? I was just looking for you. Wanted to see how you were doing, she said as she walked over to him and took his hand. She idly rubbed her thumb over the back of his hand, tracing over his scars. The most prominent one was the one that traveled from the top of his wrist before ending at his index knuckle. A few, lighter scars trailed over where the veins on his hand would be normally seen. They softly trailed over his fingers, a few reaching the tips, others not. Turning his hand over, she let her fingers trail over his palm, this side only suffering relatively light scarring compared to the rest. It had become a little thing of theirs, a deep show of intimacy. Izuku himself lifted up his hand and trailed over the scars that now decorated Ochako's face. Her right side was slightly marred from heat and shrapnel, but it did nothing to take away from her beauty in his eyes. Stop that. Your eyes, they're looking guilty again. She gave him a stern look. Izuku huffed but smiled. Only if your eyes stop looking guilty too. You didn't even have anything to do with these scars. Ochako sighed but nodded. And you didn't have anything to do with mine. Joining the fight was my decision. The fight with Overhaul had been costly, but they had no regrets. If it meant ensuring that Eri was out of his hands, they both knew they'd have done it again 1,000 times over. I know, he whispered. They rested their foreheads against each other, simply basking in the presence of their partner. And they weren't the only ones. Denki and Kyoka were sitting on her bed. Well, to be fair, he was reverse-seated on a chair in front of her bed. His shirt was off as she applied a topical cream on his back, a soothing balm that helped with his own aching scars. The first time that she'd seen them, she'd broken down in tears and he'd spent hours consoling her. Nearly all of them were Lichtenberg scars, fern-shaped trails that spiraled around his body, traces of the torture that Relampago had inflicted on Denki, as well as the leftovers of his body breaking down from his own power. Now, however, she looked at them with a sort of pride. She was proud of her Denki, and yes, he was her Denki. She wasn't afraid to admit that. And if anyone else wanted to try and get a date with him, they'd have to go through her first, something that wouldn't be easy, because they were a reminder of his strength, his fortitude, and how despite falling to darkness, he'd come back to her. The topical cream was gently applied as they remained silent, content in each other's company. Once she was finished, she let it settle for a bit before hugging him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. It was a big deal for them considering how Denki didn't let anyone approach him from behind if he could help it, always having his back to a wall, always on the lookout. She knew that he had nightmares sometimes, of Relampago's dark touch. She hugged him tighter, however, glad that he trusted her so much with this. He chuckled, a thrum beneath his chest that made her smile. Something on your mind, dear? He asked as he held onto her hands. Not really. Just enjoying the moment, she murmured, putting the thoughts away. Their relationship was private. Only a few of their friends really knew. Granted, they didn't hide anything, and if anyone asked, they'd truthfully say. But it was nice just being like this. Once finished, he put his shirt back on before turning and facing her, smiling gently as he took the cream from her hands. She smiled back as she took off her scarf, a Christmas present from him, and set it down on the bed. This was the ultimate culmination of her trust with him as she bared her throat and allowed him to apply the cream on her own scars. He was gentle and caring. Kyoka didn't really like things near her neck in general, which was one of the reasons she had started to wear a choker outside of her hero costume a few months back, or high-collared shirts or necklaces. She also tended to shy away from hugs where people wrapped their arms around her neck, though fortunately her friends and family were very understanding and would hug her body instead. Denki refrained from putting his arm around her shoulder too in consideration. It was one of the reasons that she loved him. Her eyes widened in surprise, but softened as she recognized the truth. She let him continue his ministrations, slightly humming in relief as the cream soothed her skin. Her scars were similar to his, but they had a focal point from the center of her throat and the back of her neck, branching out in similar patterns, the tips barely touching at the sides of her neck. Once he finished, she wrapped the scarf around herself and the two lied back on her bed. She loved listening to his heartbeat and the energy of his quirk humming within him. Love you, she mumbled. Love you too, he whispered, gently kissing her head. And that was that. Monoma walked up to Thorn's shrine. It had been moved out of Itsuka's room to a more public spot so that they could all pay their respects more frequently without intruding in her personal space, though he knew that Itsuka kept his helmet in her room as her own little shrine. Itsuka was there, silent as she sat in front of the shrine, memories playing through her mind. She subconsciously played with the scars on her hand, picking at it constantly. "You know," he began, standing behind her, hands clasped behind his back as he looked ahead at the shrine, his eyes meeting Thorn's. He noticed her tensing shoulders, but continued. "I think that no matter how many of the VOD I've gotten to know, and believe me, I've met a lot. I've gotten to know names, numbers, likes, dislikes, dreams, all of that." He sighed. "I don't think I'll ever escape the regret of not getting to know him." Itsuka remained quiet. "I was too prideful. More than that, I was afraid. Afraid of what I didn't understand, of what I refused to understand." Itsuka turned slightly in confusion and slight annoyance. Monoma slightly winced. She'd been unapproachable after Toga had escaped again. "Why are you saying this now?" she bit out. "Why indeed? Why not earlier, when he had the chance to? Why not earlier, when she grieved so deeply for his death? Why wait so long?" "Because I'm sorry, Kendo." She burst to her feet and whirled around to face him, furiously glaring at him. He forced himself not to flinch and stared right back at her.
Sorry.
She spat. "Now you're sorry. Where was this months ago? When we tried to beat it into your thick skull that the VOD were more than just clones, that Thorn was more than just a clone, that he was every bit a part of our class, that all he wanted was to be a part of us, but you kept being so stubborn." Hot tears began to fall down her cheeks as she clenched her fists, even going so far as to cock it back, readying herself to punch him. He still refused to flinch or divert her gaze. "Why now?" she begged to know. "Why does he accept them now?" His gaze became somber. "Because I am still afraid, and I can't afford to be anymore." She dropped her fist and bowed her head. "Why? Why come to her now?" "Because you are in pain, and you are my friend. You're our big sister, even though I'm older, and he didn't dare call himself her brother. He didn't feel remotely worthy of the title. I can't let you remain like this." She trembled and Monoma cursed the vampire girl for setting back months of therapy and recovery. He took a step, and she took one back as he hugged her.
I'm sorry.
He said again. Damn it, don't." She trembled as tears began to pool in her eyes again.
I'm sorry.
"Don't you dare! Damn you!" She tried to muster up enough anger to push him, punch him, anything.
I'm sorry.
She choked before finally breaking down, clutching him tightly as she sobbed into his shoulder, the two falling to their knees as he held her tightly. She'd been bottling up all her emotions, and it had finally come to a head. Anyone nearby had the courtesy to leave them once they saw the scene. They spent the better part of an hour there, much to Monoma's protest, but he remained firm in his support. Eventually, she passed out. Nito picked her up before facing Thorn's shrine, meeting his eyes once more. "I swear to you, Thorn, that I will protect her and the rest of my family," he said, referencing the rest of his class. "I will be what you knew I could be." He turned around and left the shrine. Although silence was his answer, he couldn't help but feel pride that wasn't his own. Perhaps Thorn was looking down on him in pride. Wherever he was, he set Itsuka down on her bed, covering her with a blanket before leaving the room. Before joining the others in the festivities, however, he had one last thing to do. "I am alive, but you are dead. I remember you. So you are eternal. Thorn." Perhaps one day, the regret would go away. Yui was giggling. "Yui, please hold still." "Ahaha, I'm sorry, I can't help it." She giggled again as Phil applied some of the topical cream on her own scar. Phil sighed and rolled his eyes fondly. Yui had long fully recovered from the blaster shot she'd taken at the camp, but the topical cream helped reduce the scarring. He also made sure to have plenty of heating pads and other things to help her since the cold weather made it ache. That combined with her period made for a very miserable girl. But fortunately, she had a wonderful boyfriend who wasn't shy about these kinds of things, nor were any of the VOD, a benefit of Izuku being raised by a single mother. Phil had recently returned from the store since she had forgotten her stuff at home when they went to visit her family for Christmas. She sighed in relief. Things had been too hectic recently, but were finally calming down after the culture festival. Truly, she was blessed. She sighed in satisfaction as she basked in his attention. Then he poked her side. Eep! A scream, an evil laugh, the sound of glass breaking, the static, grainy sound of an old movie, and the munching of popcorn. Those were the sounds permeating the dark room where a group of half a dozen individuals were occupying the single couch with blankets wrapped around them, along with a veritable buffet of snacks, soda, and some finger foods being laid out before them on a table in front of them. No, no, no. Don't go in there. That's clearly a trap. Kirishima begged the characters in the movie they were watching, despite knowing they couldn't hear his pleas. Reiko looked at the redhead and rolled her eyes. Please be quiet. You are ruining the suspense. Besides, you and Tetsu came here out of your own free volition. You said this movie was PG? The steel-quirked teen yammered, pointing an accusing finger at his ghastly friend. Oh, it is PG. Phantom chuckled, earning him the heated glare from the two manly boys. How? The both of them exclaimed in outrage. We've seen one guy getting decapitated, a girl being blended, 2 kids being eaten, and a dog torn to shreds in the most horrible ways. How in the name of anything that is holy is this PG? It's PG for pretty gory, Spectre snorted, just as another hapless character was pulled into the darkness of the building with a shriek. Please tell me the next movie isn't this bad? Nah, it's an old cowboy movie. One of the clones waved them off, which didn't inspire any confidence in the two manly boys. Surprisingly enough, it had become one of their favorite movies of all time. Endeavor calmly drank his tea. It had been years since he'd had one of Iroha's blends, and it brought back good memories. Simpler times. Happier times. Have you delivered your gift? His attention was caught by his master, the older man idly smiling as he drank his tea. I have. I send them every month, her favorite. Enji quietly said. Have you visited her? I have not. Enji whispered. I have done too much. All these years, still the boy who took too much on his shoulders. The dream of your cousins, saving your beloved friend from a loveless marriage by taking on that debt, building yourself up for your son Dash. Enji had been growling throughout his uncle's comments and had snapped. And a fat lot of good it did. He roared, fire bursting out of him in his fury. I became the best of the best, yet it was never enough. I only became number 1 because All Might retired, never from my own strength like Zuko wanted to do. I saved Rei, only to become an even worse monster than that old man. I try and train my son only for Dash. He choked. Only for him to. He started to tremble, his fire leaking out but sporadically as he desperately tried to keep himself under control. Only for him to hurt himself, die, because I wasn't strong enough to stop him. All because he wanted to make me proud? He trailed off. I never told him how I would have been proud even if he wasn't a hero. And now, all I have left is this broken family. Natsuo hates me, Fuyumi tries but I can't connect with her, too afraid to break her like I did Tuya, and Shoto. I destroyed everything. Ozai was right, Enji spat. I'm a destroyer, just like him. And yet, after you fought the Nomu, did they not come visit you in the hospital? Did that clone, Jet, not decide to continue working with you? Did Rei not send you that message? Enji grimaced, his flames petering out. I watched you. You're a piece of work, Endeavor. But you're not what we expected either. A simple letter. I'm glad you're alive. Zuko would have been proud. Enji closed his eyes, too many memories and mistakes passing through his mind. You have made many mistakes, Enji. But you are not so far gone that you need to compare yourself with Ozai. Iroh said, completely unharmed from Enji's outburst. I realized long ago that the reason you cut off contact with me is because you felt unworthy of my presence since you failed your goals. Enji remained silent. I am sorry. He blinked. What for? I should have been there regardless. I should have pushed harder, to at least try and spare you the pain. It wasn't your fault. I'm the one that pushed you away. And yet, family is supposed to stick together regardless. Inji sighed before taking a sip, only to notice that he'd boiled the tea away. Damn, it was good tea too. Iroh chuckled. I recall when you were younger, you called it nothing more than hot leaf juice. You and Zuko were similar like that. I was young and foolish. I still am foolish. Inji said as he stood up and began to make a new brew. But you are older and wiser, and more importantly, you still have time. Iroh said. Inji sighed, the early rage and despair quieting into resignation. Perhaps, to fix anything, we must start with a single step. Perhaps you would like to join us? Iroh called out. Inji heard his daughter yelp and his son curse. Ah, they had that nasty little habit of eavesdropping, a remnant from when Tuya was alive. He almost chuckled. The door slid open and Fuyumi bowed in apology. Natsuo was unrepentant, at least until Fuyumi hit him in the stomach and forced him to bow. Inji raised his brow. Fuyumi had been a lot more physical recently with her brothers. It seemed Jet and the Flame Trooper's antics had finally managed to make her snap. He was glad. They were good for his family. Damn it, Fuyumi. You are going to be respectful, she harshly whispered as she dragged Natsuo in by his ear. She then forced him to sit down at the table, undamaged of course since Inji always made sure to buy fireproof furniture, and greeted Iroh. Natsuo grumbled the entire time. The atmosphere was almost entirely awkward until Iroh broke the ice by sharing a few stories. Inji contented himself with focusing on the tea and didn't pay attention, at least until he heard the laughter. Odd, he hadn't heard Natsuo laugh like that in years. And then, Inji and Zuko come to me with the turtle duck in hand dash. Uncle, you swore you'd keep that incident secret. Inji roared in embarrassment. It's true? Natsuo was now rolling on the ground and Fuyumi, bless her, at least had the decency to try and hide hers. Inji groaned. I swear, if embarrassing stories of my childhood are what it takes for Natsuo to actually stand me, I might as well commit seppuku. Fortunately, the tea was ready. He sighed as he set it down on the table before pouring for each of them. Natsuo finally managed to calm himself and took a sip. What the hell, old man? This is actually good. It's wonderful. Even better than Mom's. Of course it is. Who do you think taught her? Inji grumbled as he took a sip. The ensuing silence made him look at his children. What? Natsuo was giving him a disbelieving look while Fuyumi looked at him questioningly. You taught Mom how to make tea. Yes. When we were younger, she couldn't brew tea to save her life. I couldn't tell you how many times she practically gave me dysentery. Inji shuddered before remembering the sheer joy the both of them had when she made a proper brew for the first time. Natsuo and Fuyumi looked at each other as they saw Inji give a soft smile, his eyes looking at something far away. They'd never seen him so soft. We heard what you said about saving Mom from a loveless marriage, accruing a massive debt. Can you tell us more? Fuyumi asked. Inji sighed before nodding. He supposed they deserved to know the truth. Perhaps he should clarify to Shoto as well. It started many years ago. I first met your mother during my first internship at Uda. Iroh smiled. The journey ahead would be tumultuous and full of hardships, but it would be worth the chance to make things right as best as possible. Perhaps this family would never fully heal. After all, too many things had happened, and that was besides the loss of the first son. But at least it was a step in the right direction. Shoyuda, Hizashi, and Namiri had their own New Year tradition. They'd gather some of their closer friends and commemorate the year while remembering those lost. Of the UA teachers, joining them were Ainin, Sekijiro, and Kin. Tensei had mostly recovered the use of his legs, though he was still benched and had joined them. Emi had come along, Shoyuda having explained their little tradition. For once, she wasn't constantly cracking jokes, understanding the solemnity of the situation. Joining them was Pons, Neo, Bly, Oddball, and Joker. It was a great honor for these clones. It was a small thing between them. They had an altar set up with photos of their fallen comrades, sake cups on it to share with them. They shared stories from their year as well as stories from the past. If Hizashi let himself be a bit more despondent, or Shoyuda a bit more rowdy, or really anything else out of the norm, well, nobody would say anything. The dinner had started slightly late, but nobody seemed to mind. Izuku smiled as he saw all his friends, teachers, and family together. He was at the end of the absolutely enormous table that fit the almost 60 people, Eri to his left and Ochako to his right. He could see well-natured arguments, people devouring food, or stealing it from each other. Laughter filled the cafeteria where they decided to hold the dinner. It was a very cheery occasion, and he smiled brightly as he saw his mother being doted on by multiple people. Now nearing 6 months into her pregnancy, she was practically glowing. Izuku himself was very excited to meet his new little sibling, though his Biri had agreed to keep the gender a surprise. Whatever that is, that baby is probably going to be the single most protected being in the world. Imagine the look on the poor fool's face who think they can use them as leverage. They will be going through the 9 circles of hell and back in a matter of seconds, especially since our brothers will kick him back out there. He heard one of his brothers comment and nodded as the clone moved around the table. Truly I am blessed above all others, he thought to himself as he thought of his family, by blood and otherwise. He noticed Eri yawning, desperately trying to stay awake. Unfortunately, a full belly and a mug of hot chocolate was counterproductive to her endeavors. Fortunately, she had a small obsession with Christmas-themed pajamas and was already ready for bed. He quickly picked her up, small grumbles along the way, and helped her get ready for bed. Eri had her own room, stuffed to the brim with gifts from VOD and UA alike. He'd been forced to put a limit on gifts from his brothers due to the sheer amount they would have been. Eri's favorite, however, was still the plushy version of him. He smiled as he laid her down to bed, the little girl instinctively curling up like a cat. It was too cute. He gently placed the blanket over her and kissed her head before quietly leaving the room. He let his thoughts gather for a bit. This was why he fought. To protect the future. Perhaps? The mindscape, symbolically named Kamino, with a K. By the VOD as a reminder of their greatest battle so far. A reference to the point where Japan officially recognized them was decorated for the holidays. Izuku, alongside the other wielders, were heading to another room. I sent them supplies, but I didn't think that they'd be able to decorate so much. Granted, it was a shipping container's worth of supplies. The second and third had elected not to join them in their little celebration, although Nana did send their regards. You'll have to forgive them. They choose to stay away due to personal reasons, though surprisingly enough they don't hold ill will against you, Nana said. Che, you're sugarcoating it, Nana, Daigoro said as he turned to Izuku. Kid, in their words, you're an idealistic idiot, but at least that doesn't stop you from making the hard decisions. Izuku raised a brow in incredulity. Considering the timeline, I'm guessing they're from the Dark Age? Got it in one. They were as close to what current society defines villains without actually being one. There was no peace, no harmony, no heroes and villains. Just people trying to survive. And I imagine that includes killing. Indeed, Hikage said from the side. Although they see your idealism as a weakness, they can respect that you're not afraid to kill. Izuku didn't know whether to be flattered or offended. Well, nice to see they're so accommodating, he wryly said. The other wielders chuckled. What else can I say of my oldest friends? Yoichi muttered with some amusement. Well, moving on, I did bring this. Izuku opened the door, the wielders gasping as they saw the table of food in front of them. I was wondering if you guys were able to eat and I thought, well, you're physical enough inside of here. So I bought stuff to make a nice dinner and some extra fried chicken too. The wielders eagerly sat at the table, vibrating in excitement. Ita de Kamasu. Izuku forced himself to ignore the questionable moans he was hearing from the wielders as they ate for the first time in centuries/decades. They deserved it. He made sure to save bentos for the other 2 wielders though. Though please, guys, show some decorum. It'd be a few weeks before he'd be able to look any of them in the eye again. I'm glad that Beer's not here. I don't think he'd be able to stand seeing Nana like this. Izuku's social media account was still relatively new, although it had gained plenty of traction thanks to Nizu's support, as well as his various collaborations with all the heroes he'd been doing partial internships with. Then, of course, was his public fight with Overhaul. That entire debacle was an overall pain in the ass. Can't forget the Culture Festival too. People really liked seeing the VOD marching. But seeing Eri reminded him of, well, all the children that had been orphaned during Kamino, and with more rumors of the droid army popping up, the League acting as well. Dabi, Twice, Toga, Shigaraki. Criminals and villains were becoming bolder, heroes were being spread thin, feeling the effects of their complacency under All Might's era. People were afraid. He made sure to take time to visit the still full refugee centers and help out whenever and wherever he could. Schools, learning centers, social media, everything. But it still wasn't enough. Everyone could sense the change in the atmosphere. Japan was heavy, for lack of a better word. Beer had compared it to when he was young. Although it hadn't quite gotten to that point, it was still prominent. People were losing their smiles, losing hope. He heard the rumors on the streets about how they were nearly at the point of war. Perhaps they already were. Considering the new year, he decided to post a message.
Menelo officiel.
Join us in this new year. A message from the VOD. In any war, there are calms between storms. An overlook of Mustafesu, snow gently falling down. There will be days when we lose faith, days when we lose hope. The video shifts to a view of a devastated Camino before switching to a refugee center, clones, students, and even heroes dedicating their time in community service during the holidays. But the day will never come that we forsake this country and its people. Children running around in the refugee center, families making the best of what they had, food being passed out as well as gifts for the children. The VOD could be seen among them, all doing their part. Although we mourn those we have lost, we must never lose sight of the future. Mandalore in full armor, on top of UA's roof, looking over the skyline. We must never give up hope and always keep fighting for our future. The camera focuses on his upper body.
EM Menelo.
And I send this message to all who will listen. He looks out towards the setting sun. We are here. The underlying message could be felt, a call to arms. A plea to join the fight against evil and stand among brothers. We are waiting. Author. What I've do when in knee. I face myself. To cross out what I've become. Erase myself. And let go of what I've done. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. I hope you all had a good Christmas, some happy holidays, and enjoy this new year that approaches. We're working hard on the next chapter, but we wanted to make this for the holidays.